In the spring of 1945, as Berlin burned and the Third Reich collapsed into rubble, one man sat closer to Adolf Hitler than almost anyone else. He wasn't a general, he wasn't a political advisor, he was a pilot. Hans Bauer had flown Hitler across Europe for over 15 years, witnessing conversations, decisions, and moments that would shape the course of history. When the war ended and Allied interrogators finally got their hands on him, they asked a simple question: what did you see? What Bauer revealed would challenge assumptions, fill in historical gaps, and provide one of the most intimate portraits of Hitler's final years ever recorded. This is the story of the man who flew the Führer and the secrets he carried from the cockpit to the prison cell. Hans Bauer was not a household name during the Second World War, and he's barely remembered today. Yet for 16 years, from 1933 to 1945, he occupied one of the most unusual positions in Nazi Germany: Adolf Hitler's personal chief pilot. This wasn't just a technical role. Bauer flew Hitler to secret meetings, military conferences, political rallies, and frontline inspections. He was present during critical moments of planning and decision-making. He heard conversations that never made it into official records. He saw Hitler in private, unguarded moments that few others witnessed. Unlike many high-ranking Nazis who died during the war or took their own lives, Bauer survived. He was captured by Soviet forces in May 1945, interrogated extensively, and held in Soviet prisons for nearly a decade. After his release in 1955, he published his memoirs, offering a detailed account of his years in Hitler's inner circle. But how much of what he said was true? How much was self-serving revision? And what did his testimony actually reveal about the man he served? To understand the significance of Bauer's revelations, we need to start at the beginning, with the question of how an ordinary pilot became one of the most trusted figures in Hitler's entourage. Hans Bauer was born in 1897 in Bavaria, Germany. He grew up in a working-class family and showed an early interest in aviation, a field that was still in its infancy. During the First World War, Bauer served as a pilot in the Imperial German Air Service, flying reconnaissance and combat missions. He was skilled, disciplined, and survived the war, an accomplishment in itself given the high casualty rates among early military pilots. After the war, Bauer transitioned to civilian aviation. He became a commercial pilot for Lufthansa, Germany's national airline, and quickly earned a reputation for reliability and precision. By the early 1930s, he was considered one of the best pilots in Germany. It was this reputation that brought him to the attention of the Nazi Party. In 1933, Adolf Hitler had just become Chancellor of Germany. The Nazi Party was consolidating power, and Hitler needed to travel frequently across the country to deliver speeches, attend rallies, and meet with party officials. Air travel was the fastest way to cover vast distances, but it was also risky. Hitler needed a pilot he could trust completely, someone with technical skill, nerves of steel, and absolute loyalty. Bauer was recommended by Lufthansa officials and by members of Hitler's security detail. In March 1933, he was summoned to meet Hitler personally. The interview was brief. Hitler asked Bauer about his flying experience, his politics, and whether he could keep secrets. Bauer, who was not yet a Nazi Party member, answered carefully. He later claimed in his memoirs that he was apolitical at the time, focused only on aviation. Whether this was true or convenient revisionism is debatable. What's certain is that Hitler hired him on the spot. From that moment, Bauer's life changed forever. He was given command of Hitler's personal aircraft, a Junkers Ju-52 trimotor plane nicknamed Immelmann II, after a famous German fighter ace. Bauer was tasked not only with flying but also with managing Hitler's entire air travel operation, including security, logistics, and the training of backup pilots. He was given the rank of SS Gruppenführer, equivalent to a lieutenant general, and became part of Hitler's immediate entourage. But what made Bauer particularly valuable wasn't just his flying ability. It was his proximity. Pilots spend hours in confined spaces with their passengers. They overhear conversations. They observe behavior. They become confidants. And Bauer, whether by design or circumstance, became one of the few people Hitler seemed to genuinely trust. What was it like to fly with Adolf Hitler? According to Bauer's memoirs, Hitler was a nervous passenger, especially in bad weather. He would sit rigidly in his seat, gripping the armrests, and would frequently ask Bauer about the flight conditions. Hitler disliked turbulence, and would sometimes request that Bauer fly at lower altitudes to avoid it, even if it meant longer flight times. But once in the air and reassured, Hitler would relax. Bauer described him as talkative during flights, often discussing politics, military strategy, architecture, and history. Hitler would sometimes ask Bauer's opinion on various matters, though Bauer claimed he always deflected, insisting he was just a pilot, not a politician. Whether Hitler respected this boundary or simply enjoyed having a captive audience is unclear. Bauer witnessed Hitler's daily routines up close. He described a man who was obsessive about punctuality when it came to public appearances, but who kept irregular hours in private. Hitler often stayed up late into the night, holding meetings or watching films, and would sleep late into the morning. Bauer had to adjust his flight schedules accordingly, sometimes waiting hours for Hitler to be ready to depart. One of the most striking aspects of Bauer's account is his description of Hitler's relationships with his inner circle. Bauer claimed that Hitler was deeply distrustful of most people, but had a small group of individuals he relied on completely. This included Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, Hermann Göring, and Martin Bormann, though Bauer noted that even these relationships were marked by manipulation and power struggles. Bauer also described Hitler's temper. He recalled several instances where Hitler erupted in rage during private conversations, berating subordinates or ranting about perceived betrayals. But Bauer claimed that Hitler never directed this anger at him personally, perhaps because Bauer maintained a professional distance and never involved himself in political intrigues. Another revelation from Bauer's memoirs concerns Hitler's health. Bauer noticed that Hitler's physical condition deteriorated significantly during the war years. By 1944, Hitler's hands trembled noticeably, he walked with a stoop, and he seemed exhausted. Bauer attributed this to stress and overwork, though historians now believe Hitler was suffering from Parkinson's disease, as well as the effects of the various medications his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, administered to him daily. Bauer also provided details about Hitler's security arrangements. Hitler was paranoid about assassination attempts, and Bauer was responsible for ensuring the safety of Hitler's flights. Every aircraft was inspected meticulously before departure. Backup planes were always on standby. Flight paths were kept secret until the last moment. Bauer himself carried a sidearm at all times and had strict orders to prevent anyone unauthorized from approaching Hitler's aircraft. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Bauer's proximity to Hitler was the access it gave him to information. He was present at Hitler's headquarters during key moments of the war. He overheard planning sessions. He flew Hitler to meetings with military commanders, foreign dignitaries, and Nazi officials. He saw the machinery of the Third Reich from the inside, and after the war, Allied interrogators wanted to know everything. As World War II progressed, Hans Bauer's role became increasingly important. Hitler traveled constantly during the early years of the war, visiting military headquarters, inspecting troops, and overseeing operations. Bauer flew him to occupied France, to the Eastern Front, to Italy, and to various locations across Germany. Each flight was a logistical challenge, requiring careful coordination with military and security forces. One of Bauer's most notable missions occurred in June 1940, when he flew Hitler to Compiègne, France, for the signing of the armistice with France. This was a moment of triumph for Hitler, the culmination of Germany's swift victory over France. Bauer described the flight as smooth and Hitler as unusually cheerful. Hitler even hummed to himself, something Bauer claimed was rare. But as the war dragged on and Germany's fortunes shifted, the mood changed. Bauer described flying Hitler to the Eastern Front in 1942 and 1943, where the reality of the grinding war against the Soviet Union became impossible to ignore. Hitler was increasingly frustrated, micromanaging military operations and clashing with his generals. Bauer recalled flights where Hitler sat in silence, staring out the window, lost in thought. By 1944, the situation had become dire. Germany was losing on all fronts. Allied bombers were pounding German cities. The D-Day invasion had opened a second front in the West. Hitler's health was failing, and his behavior became more erratic. Bauer noticed that Hitler spent more time in underground bunkers and less time traveling. The flights became shorter and less frequent. One of the most harrowing moments Bauer described was the aftermath of the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt. A bomb planted by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg exploded at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler survived with minor injuries, but the blast killed several officers and left Hitler even more paranoid and vengeful. Bauer was not present during the explosion, but he flew Hitler shortly afterward. He described Hitler as shaken but defiant, convinced that Providence had saved him for a greater purpose. As 1945 began, it was clear that Germany was facing total defeat. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, and American and British forces were closing in from the west. Hitler retreated to his bunker in Berlin, and Bauer followed. The final chapter of the war was about to begin, and Bauer would be one of the last people to see Hitler alive. By April 1945, Berlin was surrounded. The Soviet Red Army was shelling the city relentlessly, and German defenses were collapsing. Adolf Hitler had retreated to the Führer bunker, a fortified underground complex beneath the Reich Chancellery. It was here, in cramped, dim rooms, that Hitler would spend his final days. And Hans Bauer was there with him. Bauer's account of the bunker is one of the most detailed we have. He described a surreal atmosphere, a mix of denial, desperation, and fatalism. Hitler's inner circle had dwindled. Many high-ranking Nazis had fled Berlin or were trying to negotiate separate peace deals. Those who remained were either fanatically loyal or trapped. Bauer described Hitler as physically diminished, but still attempting to project authority. Hitler held daily military briefings, moving imaginary armies on maps, issuing orders to units that no longer existed. Bauer claimed that some of Hitler's staff humored him, while others quietly made plans to escape. One of the most controversial aspects of Bauer's testimony concerns Hitler's state of mind in the final days. Bauer claimed that Hitler remained convinced, until almost the very end, that Germany could still win. Hitler spoke of secret weapons, of relief forces, of a miraculous turnaround. Bauer found this delusion disturbing, but said nothing. He later admitted that he should have realized Hitler had lost touch with reality. On April 28, 1945, Hitler learned that Heinrich Himmler had been attempting to negotiate a surrender with the Western Allies. Hitler flew into a rage, denouncing Himmler as a traitor. That same day, Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun, in a brief civil ceremony. Bauer was not present at the wedding, but saw Hitler and Braun afterward. He described them as calm, almost resigned. The next day, April 29th, Hitler dictated his last will and political testament. Bauer was among those who witnessed the document. In it, Hitler blamed Germany's defeat on the betrayal of subordinates and the weakness of the German people. He appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor and expelled Himmler and Göring from the Nazi Party. On April 30, 1945, Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. Bauer was not in the room when it happened, but he was nearby. He later described hearing a single gunshot and then being summoned to view the bodies. Hitler had shot himself. Braun had taken cyanide. Bauer, along with other members of Hitler's staff, helped carry the bodies up to the Chancellery Garden, where they were doused with gasoline and burned. Bauer's description of this moment is stark and haunting. He claimed that he felt a sense of unreality, as if he were watching events unfold from a distance. He also expressed a sense of relief that it was finally over. But the nightmare wasn't finished yet. Baur and the remaining staff now had to figure out how to escape the bunker before Soviet forces arrived. After Hitler's death, chaos reigned in the bunker. The remaining staff split into small groups, each attempting to escape through the sewers and tunnels beneath Berlin. Hans Bauer joined a group that included Hitler's secretary, Martin Bormann, and several SS officers. Their plan was to break through Soviet lines and reach German-held territory to the west. It was a desperate gamble. Berlin was completely surrounded, and Soviet soldiers were everywhere. Bauer's group moved through the dark tunnels, trying to stay quiet and avoid detection. At one point, they emerged above ground and tried to cross a bridge, but Soviet forces opened fire. Several members of the group were killed instantly. Bauer was wounded in the leg and couldn't continue. He collapsed in a shell crater and was found by Soviet soldiers the next morning, May 2, 1945. He was taken prisoner, along with dozens of other captured Germans. Bauer assumed he would be executed on the spot. Instead, he was transported to a Soviet military headquarters for interrogation. The Soviets immediately recognized Bauer's importance. His name was on a list of high-value targets, individuals who had been close to Hitler and might possess critical information. Bauer was questioned extensively about Hitler's death, the location of Nazi gold, secret weapons programs, and the whereabouts of other Nazi leaders. Bauer cooperated to a point. He confirmed that Hitler was dead and described the circumstances of his suicide. He provided details about the final days in the bunker. But he also withheld information, particularly about escape routes and the fates of certain individuals. He later claimed that he was trying to protect people who had helped him. The Soviets were skeptical. They wanted physical proof of Hitler's death, and Bauer couldn't provide it. The bodies had been burned, and the remains were fragmentary. Soviet forces had recovered what they believed were Hitler's remains, but there were doubts. Stalin himself was reportedly unconvinced and ordered further investigations. Bauer was transferred to Moscow and held in Lubyanka prison, the infamous headquarters of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. There, he was interrogated repeatedly, sometimes for hours at a time. The Soviets used various techniques: isolation, sleep deprivation, psychological pressure. Bauer later described these sessions as grueling, but said he was never physically tortured. Over time, Bauer provided more details. He drew diagrams of the bunker. He identified photographs of Nazi officials. He described Hitler's health, habits, and final orders. Soviet interrogators compiled hundreds of pages of testimony, much of which remained classified for decades. But the Soviets wanted more. They suspected Bauer knew the locations of hidden Nazi assets, gold, art, documents. Bauer insisted he knew nothing about such matters. He was just a pilot, he said. The interrogators didn't believe him. Hans Bauer would spend the next 10 years in Soviet prisons and labor camps. It was a harsh existence. He was held in various facilities across the Soviet Union, often in solitary confinement. The conditions were brutal: inadequate food, no medical care, freezing temperatures in winter. Bauer's wounded leg never healed properly, and he developed chronic health problems. During this time, Bauer was interrogated periodically, but the intensity lessened as the years went by. The Soviets seemed to have extracted everything of immediate value. Bauer spent most of his time in isolation, with little contact with other prisoners. He later said that he occupied himself by mentally reconstructing flights he had made, recalling routes, landmarks, and details to keep his mind sharp. In 1955, after Stalin's death and a general thaw in Soviet policy, a group of German prisoners, including Bauer, were released as a gesture of goodwill to West Germany. Bauer returned to Germany after more than a decade in captivity. He was 58 years old, in poor health, and stepping into a world that had moved on without him. West Germany in 1955 was a very different place from the Third Reich. The country was rebuilding, focused on economic recovery and integration with the West. There was little appetite for revisiting the Nazi past in detail. Many former Nazis had quietly reintegrated into society. Bauer found himself in a strange position. He was notorious for his association with Hitler, but he wasn't considered a major war criminal. He hadn't been involved in atrocities or policy decisions. He was, as he always claimed, just a pilot. But Bauer had a story to tell. And in 1956, he published his memoirs under the title Ich flog mächtige der Erde, I flew the powerful of the earth. The book was a sensation in Germany and was later translated into several languages. It offered one of the most detailed insider accounts of Hitler's final years and became a key source for historians studying the period. But how reliable was Bauer's testimony? That question has been debated ever since. Hans Bauer's memoirs contain numerous revelations, some mundane, others shocking. He provided detailed descriptions of Hitler's daily routines, his relationships with key Nazi figures, and the atmosphere in the bunker during the final days. He also made several claims that have sparked debate among historians. One of the most significant revelations concerns Hitler's decision-making process. Bauer claimed that Hitler was increasingly isolated from reality during the final years of the war. He described instances where Hitler issued orders based on outdated information or refused to accept reports that contradicted his expectations. Bauer suggested that many of Hitler's military decisions in 1944 and 1945 were disastrous precisely because he was making them in an information vacuum, surrounded by yes-men who were afraid to contradict him. Bauer also provided insights into the power struggles within Hitler's inner circle. He described bitter rivalries between figures like Göring, Goebbels, Himmler, and Bormann. He claimed that these men were more interested in positioning themselves for the future than in serving Germany's interests. Bauer portrayed himself as above these intrigues, focused only on his duty as a pilot. Critics have questioned this self-portrayal, suggesting that Bauer was more complicit in the Nazi regime than he admitted. Another controversial aspect of Bauer's memoirs is his description of Hitler's suicide. Bauer confirmed that Hitler shot himself and that Eva Braun took poison, but he also claimed that there was confusion immediately afterward about what to do with the bodies. He described a chaotic scene, with people arguing about whether to bury the bodies or burn them, and whether to try to preserve them. This account has been corroborated by other witnesses, lending credibility to Bauer's testimony on this point. Bauer also addressed the question of whether Hitler could have escaped Berlin. He stated unequivocally that escape was impossible by April 30, 1945. The bunker was surrounded, Soviet forces were closing in, and any attempt to flee would have resulted in capture or death. Bauer dismissed conspiracy theories that Hitler survived and fled to South America or elsewhere as absurd. He had seen the body. He had helped burn it. Hitler was dead. But Bauer's credibility has been questioned on several points. Some historians have noted that his memoirs contain factual errors and inconsistencies. For example, Bauer sometimes confused dates or misidentified individuals. He also had a tendency to downplay his own involvement in the Nazi regime, presenting himself as a non-political professional who just happened to be caught up in events. Moreover, Bauer never fully reckoned with the moral implications of his service to Hitler. He expressed regret about the war and Germany's defeat, but he rarely discussed the Holocaust or the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. In his memoirs, he focused almost entirely on his role as a pilot and his observations of Hitler, avoiding difficult questions about complicity and responsibility. Critics have also pointed out that Bauer benefited financially from his memoirs. The book was a bestseller, and Bauer gave numerous interviews and lectures about his experiences. Some have suggested that he tailored his story to be as sensational as possible, emphasizing dramatic moments and insider details while omitting or minimizing anything that might implicate him in war crimes. Despite these controversies, Bauer's memoirs remain an important historical source. They provide a unique perspective on Hitler and the final days of the Third Reich, and many of his claims have been verified through other sources and declassified documents. Historians continue to mine his testimony for insights, even as they approach it with appropriate skepticism. So what did Hans Bauer actually reveal after the war? What can we learn from his testimony that we couldn't learn elsewhere? First, Bauer provided an intimate portrait of Hitler as a person, not just as a historical figure. He described Hitler's quirks, his fears, his routines. He showed us a man who was paranoid about flying in bad weather, who stayed up late watching movies, who could be charming one moment and terrifying the next. This humanizing detail doesn't excuse Hitler's actions, but it helps us understand how he functioned on a day-to-day level. Second, Bauer confirmed many details about the final days in the bunker that might otherwise have remained murky. His descriptions of Hitler's physical decline, his delusional military planning, and the chaos after his suicide have been corroborated by other witnesses and are now accepted as historically accurate. Bauer's testimony helped establish the timeline of events and clarified what happened during those final chaotic hours. Third, Bauer shed light on the inner workings of Hitler's entourage. He described the power struggles, the rivalries, the fear that pervaded Hitler's inner circle. He showed how Hitler's leadership style, based on manipulation and divide-and-conquer tactics, created a toxic environment where loyalty was demanded, but trust was impossible. Fourth, Bauer's testimony has been valuable in debunking conspiracy theories. His insistence that Hitler died in the bunker, that there was no secret escape, has been important in countering persistent myths. While some people will always believe alternative narratives, Bauer's first-hand account, combined with other evidence, has helped historians establish the facts. Finally, Baur's story raises important questions about complicity and responsibility. He was not a policymaker. He didn't design the Holocaust. He didn't issue military orders, but he served Hitler loyally for 16 years, enabling Hitler's travels and operations. He witnessed the machinery of the Nazi state up close and said nothing. After the war, he expressed regret about Germany's defeat, but not about his own role. His case illustrates the moral complexities of the Nazi regime, where ordinary individuals made choices that cumulatively enabled extraordinary evil. Hans Bauer's revelations have been the subject of extensive historical debate. Some scholars view him as a generally reliable witness whose testimony provides valuable insights into Hitler's final years. Others are more skeptical, pointing to the self-serving nature of his memoirs and the factual errors they contain. One major point of contention is Bauer's claim that he was apolitical. Historians have found evidence that Bauer was, in fact, a member of the Nazi Party and the SS, and that he participated in party activities. While he may not have been ideologically committed in the same way as figures like Goebbels or Himmler, he was clearly more than just a neutral professional doing his job. Another debate concerns Bauer's knowledge of Nazi atrocities. Bauer claimed that he knew little about the Holocaust and other crimes, that he was focused on flying and didn't pay attention to politics. Historians find this claim dubious. As a member of Hitler's inner circle, with access to high-level conversations and documents, Bauer would have known at least the outlines of what was happening. His professed ignorance looks more like deliberate evasion than genuine innocence. There's also debate about the accuracy of specific details in Baur's memoirs. Some of his descriptions have been confirmed by other sources, but others cannot be verified. Historians must therefore use his testimony carefully, cross-referencing it with other accounts and treating it as one piece of evidence among many, not as definitive truth. Despite these debates, Bauer's testimony has had a lasting impact on our understanding of the Third Reich. His memoirs have been cited in countless books, documentaries, and scholarly articles. His descriptions of Hitler's final days have shaped the popular imagination of how the war ended, and his story continues to fascinate people more than 70 years after the fact. After his release from Soviet captivity and the publication of his memoirs, Baur lived quietly in West Germany. He gave occasional interviews but largely stayed out of the public eye. He never held another professional position and lived on his book royalties and a modest pension. He died in 1993 at the age of 96, one of the last surviving members of Hitler's inner circle. In his final years, Bauer was occasionally approached by historians and journalists who wanted to discuss his experiences. He generally cooperated but remained consistent in his narrative. He was a pilot who did his duty, who witnessed history, and who had no regrets about his professional conduct. Whether he genuinely believed this or whether it was a psychological defense mechanism, we cannot know. The story of Hans Bauer is, in many ways, a story about proximity and perspective. Bauer spent 16 years at Hitler's side, closer than almost anyone else, yet he claimed to have remained detached, focused only on flying. He witnessed momentous events, but insisted he was just doing his job. He survived the war, told his story, and lived a long life, while millions of others perished. What can we learn from Baur's revelations? First, that history is often shaped by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Bauer was not a mastermind or a fanatic. He was a skilled technician who made choices that placed him at the center of one of history's darkest chapters. His story reminds us that the machinery of evil requires not just ideologues, but also professionals, administrators, and specialists who enable its functioning. Second, Bauer's testimony illustrates the challenges of historical memory. After the war, many Germans struggled with how to remember the Nazi period, how to acknowledge guilt while also moving forward. Bauer's memoirs reflect this tension. He provided valuable information, but also engaged in self-justification. He helped historians understand what happened, but also crafted a narrative that minimized his own responsibility. Third, Bauer's story raises questions about loyalty and judgment. He remained loyal to Hitler until the very end, even as it became clear that Germany was heading for catastrophic defeat. Was this admirable dedication to duty or moral blindness? When does loyalty become complicity? These are questions that remain relevant today, whenever individuals must decide whether to remain loyal to leaders or institutions engaged in wrongdoing. Finally, Bauer's revelations remind us of the importance of multiple perspectives in understanding history. No single account can capture the full truth of complex events. Bauer's testimony is valuable, but it must be read alongside the testimonies of victims, of other perpetrators, of neutral observers. Only by assembling these multiple perspectives can we approach something like historical truth. Hans Bauer flew the Führer for 16 years. He was there at the beginning, when Hitler rose to power, and he was there at the end, when Hitler's empire collapsed into ruin. He witnessed conversations, decisions, and moments that shaped the course of the 20th century. What he revealed after the war has helped historians piece together the puzzle of Hitler's final years. But his revelations also raise uncomfortable questions about complicity, memory, and the choices ordinary people make in extraordinary times. The man in the cockpit saw everything. The question is, what did he choose to see, and what did he choose to ignore? That question, perhaps, is the most important revelation of all. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.